It's a beautiful day. I decided I'd go for a walk and talk about story points. Coco, you want to go for a walk? A few weeks ago, I posted a prompt online. I said, hey, do you have any questions about product management or Scrum? I said, comment below and I'll answer in a new thread. So I got a question. What do you think about story points? Okay, in brief, I think story points are not very useful in most circumstances, but an interesting concept in some limited contexts. Let's talk about first, what is a story point? We have to unravel that and ask, what is a story? Now, I recently published a blog article about the history of the user story. Please check it out. In a nutshell, let me say this. A user story is often written on a card. It's written while we're in conversation with a user. We talk to the user and we write down the things that come out of their face. That is a user story. The concept of story has then been expanded. A story is a way of describing functionality or behaviors of a product that we may build for end users. And now, not all behaviors will have equal value, and therefore we have a proper dilemma. How do we choose which stories to take action on and which stories should we defer? We would want to act on the stories that have high potential value. Now, imagine we're painting a fence. I could take a stopwatch and paint one board. I could measure the perimeter of my property and then calculate the amount of time required to paint the fence. That would be a rational estimate, a rational, logical, factor-based estimate. But what if we're painting a portrait or the ceiling of a chapel? Talking about creative work, knowledge work. We can't say with any kind of certainty that a song will take 12 hours to write and a book would take 100 hours and a movie would be 3,000 hours. Obviously, those numbers are wildly inaccurate. Humans, it turns out, aren't very good at estimating creative work in terms of time. We are pretty good, though, at comparing the relative effort of creative work. We could say with some confidence that writing a song is less effort than making a movie. Of course, musicians are coming out of the woodwork now to strangle me. Now, points, a set of numbers that we can invent just to give us a sense of size, like small, medium, and large. We can say a song is 10 points, a book 100 points, a movie 1,000 points. Do the points indicate hours or days? No, they have no such meaning. They're just relative numbers used to compare the assumed size of different types of creative work. Let that be a quick description of the concept of story points. Story points can be effective to help break the habit of time-based estimation. Although, I have to admit, it rarely breaks that habit. If you are using time-based estimates currently, try using relative estimation techniques like story points instead. If you are already using relative estimation techniques like story points, challenge them. Question whether they are still adding value to the process. Do they still communicate with the stakeholders what you want them to communicate? Are the stakeholders developing awkward habits around the use of those numbers? And if so, consider a change. And if you're using a digital system like Jira or others, Jira happens to be particularly problematic in this regard, but I recommend do not store the story point estimate on the item. Do not use sums or averages of story points to calculate the team's velocity. I encourage product managers and stakeholders to, instead of thinking in terms of timelines and deadlines and fixed scope releases, think in terms of sequence. What do we want to take to market, and in what sequence? I think that this changes the conversation instead to frequent releasing, which I would argue is almost universally preferable than infrequent release. Frequent releases of small batches of features or functionality is what I advocate for and what I recommend. And in order to do that, product managers must use estimates of value or effort only to make trade-offs in the moment. What are we going to do next, and what are we not going to do next? Now, of course, I'm not advocating for short-term thinking and minimum visibility. I'm advocating for short-term focus, near-term focus, to deliver into the marketplace the features that will unlock the next business opportunity. How do we attract our first investor? Then how do we attract our first customer? How do we expand into the next marketplace? How do we expand into a new jurisdiction, another country? These are product-based business objectives. And if those business objectives imply that the work is not small batch, that perhaps there's a lot of effort required to create the necessary features to attract the first customer, well, then break down the business objective into something more granular. So on the road to attract our first customer, perhaps we can release just enough functionality to attract our first friendly tester, our first early bird adopter. I hope that you can see in this analogy that product managers need to make trade-offs about priority more than they need to create timelines. And story points aren't always needed for that. May be useful in the moment, maybe a quick exercise with stakeholders and the team while planning for the next release or for the next 2 or 3 sprints. And then throw away those story point estimates. They're to be discarded. They're not to be used any further. If you need to make new decisions about the sequence of the backlog, then, well, these estimation techniques are so lightweight that they can be rerun quickly and frequently in order, again, to make trade-offs in the moment about what to do next and what to do not next. I think I'll end the video with a brief story about a team I consulted with a few years ago. And in this story, I think, are some recommendations about how to use or not use story points. So this team had a challenge whereby their stakeholders fell into the common habit of using the story point numbers to calculate and schedule feature delivery over the calendar. Features ABC will be done by August. Features XYZ will be done by October. And then the stakeholders also conflated the concept of estimate with commitment. And they would say things like, hey team, it's now late October. Features XYZ aren't ready yet. You're late. When in reality, the story point numbers would never have been able to predict for the stakeholders how much time on the calendar would be required, or predict the level of disruption or dysfunction that would get in the way of the team as they were trying to build this functionality. So the team decided to change the way that they communicate these story point numbers to the stakeholders. Now, this was a team that used physical cards on a wall in a team room, but this lesson relates even if you're using a digital system. What the team decided to do was to stop writing the story point numbers on the cards. Instead, they would write the story point estimate on a sticky note and attach the sticky note to the corner of the card. It was subtle, But the change clearly indicated to stakeholders that these numbers were temporary. Not only temporary, but they would easily fall off. So I remember being in a sprint review kind of meeting with the team, and the stakeholders were there. And there was one stakeholder in particular that was like visibly distraught because up on the wall were the product backlog items for what they perceived were the next sprint or sprints. And the sticky notes of a few product backlog items had fallen off and were on the floor. And the stakeholder pointed this out. Hey team, what happened to those? It looks like those estimates fell off. And there was a bit of a silence. And then the product owner broke the silence and said, yes, the estimates fell off. The stakeholder was struggling with this. The lesson is that there was no reason that stakeholders should have gotten attached to those numbers in the first place. So again, thanks for the question. Please comment below and let me know what you think about story points. How do you use them? Are they effective or ineffective? What kinds of pitfalls do you experience? Thanks for watching.